Hey, we are about to start. So first, we know that we have some problems with the audio, but in the longer break, we're going to fix it. And now let's introduce the next speaker, Jasveen Sandral. He currently lives in Japan, and he's really nice guy because last night we had a dinner and he brought Japanese snacks. So that's cool. And today he's going to talk about his contributions to Ruby. He has contributed to CSV TSV module, and he will tell us about his journey. So let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be in the Balkans region of Europe to speak about my journey to contribute to Ruby. I never really thought I could speak about my experience about contribution, and somehow it made it into a Ruby release. So today, the presentation is sort of technical, but I'll try to make it not technical. And we'll be starting with some basic problems that few developers face, and what is the solution, and what is the entire contribution process, including reviewers and testing or something, and what happened with the releases, and how can we make such contributions really focused on the long term, because this presentation, this theme is the long-term thinking about Ruby. So just a little bit of introduction about me. I'm a software engineer based in Japan, so it took quite a while to come all the way to the other part of the world. And I'm mostly interested in hardware and software. So sometimes I build things with hardware, software, and everything in the middle. So that means I like working with IoT, Internet of Things, but also industrial Internet of Things, which is IoT. And it's interesting to also work on some sort of statistics or mathematical, geometrical computations. And right, so this Ruby presentation that I'm going to talk about was sort of not my first open source contribution, but it took a while, roughly 1 month. And we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. So since we are talking about the long term, we have to always keep in mind that when we make some decision or when we make some sort of contribution to any open source library, it's not just about our own convenience or, let's say, any decision, but we have to think in terms of decades, because the days are short, but the days are long, but the decades are short. So it's really important to have the thinking of a long-term perspective. And every line of code that we write has some sort of code depth with it and some sort of technical weight. So everything you write today is going to have an impact, let's say 10 years down the line, because your code is going to be used by hundreds of thousands of developers. So I was working on some sort of a TSV. So we all know what is TSV, it's the tab separated value format. So we know there are two very simple formats, CSVs and TSVs, and most of us work with CSVs, but the hospitals or the bioinformatics sector, they work a lot with TSV because it's easy for them to process, they consume less space, the time processing is faster. But how many of you have ever worked with TSV in Ruby? Because it's nice to see if there's any real impact. Is there anybody who's tried to use TSVs? Okay, so that's like 5 or 10% of the population here. But the point is that in programming languages like Python or R, which are very data processing specific, or which are really used for financial or mathematical things, they have inbuilt support for TSV, but not Ruby. And I was sort of surprised that a language which is used by hundreds of thousands of developers never really had a concrete the method to use TSV files. And that also made me realize that if I contribute somehow in terms of an API development or a program, is it really going to have an impact down the line? Because if it does, somebody must have done it before. But if I do it, is it something special? And so this is a very simple case study. Let's not get very technical because it might bore most of us. But the point is, if you were trying to work with TSV files today, you would have to specifically mention the /t, which you see on the top, because you have to specify that you're using a tab-separated value, not a comma-separated value. That also means that it's a little bit bothersome. So the basic question that comes here is like, let's say there's a new Ruby developer, and let's say if, regardless of whether they have programming experience or not, if they would like to work with, TSVs, do they know that they have to use a column-separated parameter for t? And is it really needed? Because isn't it bothersome for them to figure out how to do it? And shouldn't there be some easier solution to work for? So, I myself had this problem sometime before where I was trying to figure out, why don't they have TSP format? But I just thought it's not important because, maybe somebody's going to do it, or maybe it's not important, or maybe Ruby doesn't think it's important. But then I was looking around, and then I saw that somebody asked the same question before. Like, there was somebody called Kojix2, and he said that this was in January 2023, so we're talking about 2 years, more than 2 years before. He said, right now, there's no support for the tab-separated value, and it requires 8 keystrokes, because when you type like column-separated t, and it doesn't make sense because in languages like Python or R, you have the inbuilt support. So it took some courage to make some proposal, even in the first place, forget about making a change. And there were some other discussions here where they said you can just do /t, or somebody said you can just convert that TSV to CSV in the process. There's no need to suggest something new because they think that the core depth or technical, some sort of depth is going to be high. So it was sort of a new thinking idea for me because why isn't there a better way to handle TSV files in Ruby in the first place? And that's when I realized that there's probably an opportunity to contribute something meaningful to other developers where I don't do just my job at work, but something giving back to the society, because we all use open source a lot. And we don't often think, how can we contribute, or how can we make it think for the long term? So I'm going to talk about my contribution part. It's going to be 2 parts right now. So when this discussion happened, there was originally 2 problems. One was, should we have a support for TSV? Or second was, should we have the SEP, like the separator, specifically? So my initial approach, because I was not sure, I wanted to add both an alias.sep and a TSV class. But then I opened the PR, the 317, and it was closed right away after 2 minutes. I said, go figure out, we don't want to do both of them at once. So that's what you see there. I was asked to split it, and it was rejected. But then on my second approach, I tried to put .sep, and I tried to put an alias only, but it got rejected again. And I was sort of like, okay, I think there's no point I have to contribute here. Too much rejections keep happening here. But then I realized, okay, maybe this is something new. If I fail, I learn something new anyways. But the main point was that I learned that when you make changes to the core libraries, it's very important that you make atomic changes. So that means you make incremental changes. You don't try to put everything at once. And it's very important that if you would really like to make a change in the core library, maybe you try to do some sort of black box testing, and you try to make incremental changes every now and then and try to see how it makes changes. So the second part, on my third attempt, this was the PR. I mean, it's a spoiler, but it absolutely, it got accepted in the end. But the point here is I just focused on the TSV class. And when I did that, one of the reviewers, he said, do we really need to override all of the methods? Like, he was really talking about the final design, which means he was asking me to think of a much, much simpler implementation, because when this sort of discussion happened, I realized that should we use the CSV double colon TSV, or should we just use double colon TSV? Which made me think about API design a lot, because it was not just about thinking about the library changes, but what sort of changes is it going to have on the API design if we really think very long term. So this is the final solution. I'm sharing it in advance so everybody has an idea what we're going to talk about. But the point is that it is just 3 lines of code, and it was so much simpler. The point here was that instead of implementing something out of the box, we were just trying to inherit the CSV class directly. So we just automatically get all of the functionality, because that's how classes work. And one of the biggest reasons was that there was 0 maintenance burden, because if you make any changes to the CSV class, it gets copy forwarded to the TSV. So there's no headache for the maintainers. And it was like an interesting discussion happening there. But of course, there were so many interesting things, like the solution follows the principle of least surprise, that users can now expect TSV, which means you can use CSV, you can also use TSV, but let's say if you would like to override the options, let's say if your tab separated is 2 or 3 times, or let's say there are any other changes you want, you can do that. And the thing here was that we really needed to find a balance between convention and the configuration. And so this is an interesting case. I was asked to write a test to check if the function that I wrote was actually working. So let's just not get very technical. You can see that in the beginning, it just checks if the tab separated is default, if it's tab or not, and then we check if we can override it somehow, and finally just checks it. But the question really is, are there any tests missing? Because I just wrote that test, it got accepted, I'm happy, but then that's not the point if we are talking about the long term. So if you think about it for a moment, there are tens of examples you might think of. What about empty files? What about a problem in the file name? Or what about so many hundred cases? So that means in the long run, even though we write test cases like this, every developer has their own problems. That means when you write code, especially for the core libraries, you have to think about the long term, and the tests have to be modified time by time. So let's say if you're working on TSP files, and if you think that, okay, if I send an empty file, it doesn't work. Like the tests pass, but I don't get what I want. So you can contribute that way, if that's a good starting point. And that also goes very long term. And so there was a bit of discussion on the namespace, because I just wanted to use the TSV, double colon TSV, because it's sort of easy to write, and it sort of is Ruby conscious, but there was also an argument for it. And there's something called namespace pollution, like you have to mention all of the libraries together. So in the beginning, I preferred the global namespace for simplicity, because when you think of namespace pollution, it's sort of like a technical debt, because you do something with CSV that gets carried forwarded to the TSV. But let's just think about the example that I wrote here. How many of you here would prefer a developer convenience when you would like to make some sort of change? Can I get a hands up? So there's only one, but how many of you would prefer an ecosystem stability? So that's a huge number. But what that means is when we look for very short fixes, it's like fix quick, or we just want something running, we focus on developer convenience. That's what I did. But the reviewers were really thinking about the long term, and they said, that's not how it works. You have to think about the ecosystem stability. And that was sort of an eye-opening thing for me too, when the reviewer said, is it intentional? Because you might want to use it, but it's going to break all the APIs. That means it's breaking changes. And so the rejected path, when the reviewer told me that you have to be consistent with reviewer spec, reviewers app, it taught me a lot about API design. So, I had to go through a couple of principles because I initially wanted to use the colon SCP because it's simpler and, it's saving a couple of keystrokes. So I'm lazy. I don't want to type everything together. But the reviewers really taught me that you have to focus on the core libraries because if it's working this way, you have to follow the patterns. And but of course, if you think about pandas or R, it's so much simpler to write there again. And there are like 3 lessons that I've learned so far. I just made 3 lines of code change, and it has 0 maintenance cost. So that means when you make some really long-term changes, you might want to think about having not so much of maintenance burden on the developers. And I also came to believe that when you make some changes in the core libraries, every single line is like a potential liability. So you might want to push it now, it gets pushed, but on the very long term, it's going to affect hundreds of thousands of developers. So we have to think about the liability too. And this code really sums it up. You don't have to be perfect, but you just have to figure out how it works. And for my second lesson, so as I was talking about namespaces, I figured out that namespace really, any decision you make with namespace is going to affect the entire ecosystem. So that means I wanted to use something simpler because I'm lazy. I don't want to type everything. But if I just use the :TSV, it's going to have a potential conflict on the other libraries. But if I just use the already existing CSV, inherit all the features from them, then there's a peaceful coexistence. And the biggest thing is there's no namespace pollution. So that means there's no technical debt, probably. But how many of you might have encountered some of namespace conflicts? So it's only a handful, like a couple of us, but the point really is we really have to think about long term because that's the point. When we really don't think about namespace pollution, it's sort of like thinking only in the short run, and the mindset has to be changed to be thinking for the long term. And this is something that we just discussed. How many of you might have seen? So not so many of us, but still. And this is my third and last lesson. So backward compatibility is really important with these sort of tests because when we do some sort of breaking changes, let's say when I was implementing this thing, it's just a thing to make me look away for after 20 minutes. That doesn't really work. I don't look away. But the point is that sometimes when we make changes, especially to the core libraries, there's a very high chance that it's going to have a breaking change. And somewhere down the line, those breaking changes are necessary, but it's going to be very costly over the very long term, which is the theme of this presentation. And I sort of now understand why Ruby core is so careful about changes, because if you try to go to the Ruby's PRs, you might see a lot of PRs get rejected straight away because they really think about stability. And by stability, I mean long-term stability, because this project is mostly long-term. So they really think, they really want you to be careful about every single change that you make. And Rails 4.0, so we had the Rails 3.1 released 3 months back, and I think sometime soon there's going to be new changes made. So when you make any change, especially to the core libraries, we have to understand that all of the gems are going to also get updated. So there has to be a really long-term thinking. And so this is the impact. Finally, after a month, the contribution got released. It's somewhere in the last added CSV, TSV support. And it was sort of surprising. I was not expecting my changes to get selected in the first place, but even if it did, I did not think it was going to get released. And it was sort of a big thing because seeing my code in an official Ruby release was incredibly rewarding. But it's not only about that. It is more like developers can now write cleaner code, and it's more semantic code. And since I'm based in Japan, Ruby has a huge base in Japan. A lot of companies use Ruby, and we have a lot of user groups there. So I tried to spread the word, and there's very positive feedback about it, because there are some changes that people are looking for, but we just don't make it, or we think it's bothersome to, make changes or something. But the point is, if you think there's even a small change, like 3 lines of code change, if you think that's potentially going to impact lives of hundreds of thousands of developers down the line, I think it's very much worth it to give it a try. And so this is how it is today. So from now onwards, if you would like to use the TSVs directly, you just have to mention the CSV :TSV of read. So you can use all of the properties of CSVs directly as TSVs instead of separating, mentioning a :SEP. And it's the code looks much cleaner and intuitive now, because now I can just read a TSV file, and I can do, I can generate something, I can just read it, and it's so much easier, which was not possible before. And so this is probably the last lesson. None of us is as smart as all of us, which is basically what this conference is about, the long term. So I contributed a little bit. The reviewers taught me something. I had to learn about API designs. I had to learn about the breaking changes. I had to learn how could this impact the lives of millions of developers. And the review process can be incredibly challenging, especially when you're just contributing and it's like rejected, and you don't know if it's going to go through. But the review process made the final solution so much better. And I think when we contribute to open source, because I also try to contribute to Golang, Apache, it's the PLC, which is the hardware software stuff. I think one of the biggest things about open source contribution is it requires persistence, because you're working somewhere, the other developer is in a completely different time zone, and he might not be free every single day. Maybe he works only 2 hours a week. So I think it's really important to be persistent, but I think the results are worth it when it gets released. And this is just a simple question. Maybe we all have our own shares of code review feedback, how they make us a better developer. And I think it's really important, again, in the long term. I keep coming back to it, but I think really thinking from that perspective and not just thinking from the fixing fast solution works. And these are my core principles. After this, this sort of fix got implemented, I feel that, when you're building for forever, you are accepting that your code is, likely outliving your memory of writing it. So let's say I might have contributed 10 years down the line, I see somebody making some more change, I might not even remember it, but the point is that we might not remember it, but we really have to think about building for forever sort of mindset. And it was just a very small decision of making API changes. It was just like adding 3 lines, but this seemingly small decision has made a big impact on the API development, which is surprising to see. And these are some of the principles that I think were worth it, and which I learned from. And this is the last slide. So if my talk motivated you, and if you think there's some problem you might want to fix, you might think this exists in Python, this exists in Rust, or this might exist in Java, but it does not exist in Ruby, I think it's the best place to start, because Ruby core specifically needs diverse perspectives. The developers who made the CSV file might not know that you might want to use TSV 10 years down the line, or maybe some new library comes up, and we never know that there's going to be some sort of diverse perspective. So I think that works. And I think to begin with, like I told, black box testing helps, and incremental changes help, or just writing some documentation also helps. And I'm not a big open source contributor. It is my second or third open source contribution, but if I can help anybody on this, I'll be happy to help. And thank you for listening so far.